welcome back to the Imperfect Podcast. I'm your host, Kirsten Pfeiffer, and today I am joined by Benji Nolot. He is the founder and CEO of Exodus Cry, which is a nonprofit committed to abolishing sex trafficking and breaking the cycle of commercial sexual exploitation. Benji is committed to the abolition of modern-day slavery by campaigning to shift cultural mindsets and laws and that would abolish commercial sexual exploitation. He has also been a featured speaker at the United Nations and is an award-winning filmmaker. In everything that he does, he is driven by the conviction that every person should be free. So welcome, Benji. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's an honor.
Yeah. So I feel like there's so many things that we can go into as even before we started recording this, like there's just so many things that we're aligned on and share a lot of passion for. But obviously, two of those things are anti-human trafficking and filmmaking. And so I'd love if you could just get started by telling us a little more about Exodus Cry and how you started that.
Yeah, it's great just rapping with you even before we started, just because it's rare for us in this space to meet other people that are pursuing film with such passion and also carrying such a tender heart for the issue of human trafficking. And so that's just a huge part of our story at Exodus Cry, is going after this really serious justice issue that our society, that our world is facing, and doing it in a way that really prioritizes film as a means to help raise awareness, to educate people, and to help spearhead these campaigns that actually have the potential to move the needle on some very serious issues, again, that our culture has to face and that we have to wrestle with and that we're dealing with. So it is just such an honor to connect with you. I had a chance to be at the screening of your short film about human trafficking. And so, yeah, really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, you too. And like we talked about this a little bit before, but just for everyone listening, it's been such a serendipitous, I feel like, path of like finally meeting you, because one of the organizations that I learned about really early on, Saving Innocence, which anyone that has listened to the previous episode with Alan Smith and Jessica Midkiff, they both are from Saving Innocence, and our mutual friend Kim Biddle, who founded Saving Innocence, I was staying at her house 2 years ago, and she told me about this documentary that she had been part of, and it was made by her friend Benji, and you need to meet him. And here 2 years later, we're sitting here. So even that is just so encouraging, because like, as we'll get into this, all of this is obviously very, very dark, and it can be really discouraging. And like, how am I even making an impact? This is such a huge issue. But I think realizing like there is a bigger picture here, and just seeing that trajectory and getting aligned with people that are also doing something about this. And so to that point, I think even wanting to do something about this issue, like before I got involved, I was like, you hear the number of like, there are 40.3 million victims worldwide. What am I going to do to help this? And I think that blocks a lot of people. So how did you start? Like, what was your journey, and like what inspired you to get involved in this fight? And did you experience that kind of resistance, and how did you overcome that to get to like where you are now?
I heard this phrase from a friend named Hannah Wong, and she said, she was giving this spoken word. She said, we have to resist the voice inside of us telling us it's okay to do nothing about sex trafficking. And she gave it in the context of this larger spoken word that was really powerful. So I think that kind of summarizes my own conviction about this issue. And even just going back to the very first moment that I heard about human trafficking, I knew I had a choice to make in that moment. I'm either going to lean into this or completely run away from it. And honestly, my first instinct was the idea that there's 40 million people trapped in the commercial sex industry around the world, and just knowing the exploitation that goes along with that. My natural impulse was, this is too overwhelming. Yeah. What can I do? And I had already sort of had this justice chips. I already felt kind of like, you know, that my compassion bandwidth was maxed. Yeah. And I remember the next day after I had first heard about human trafficking for the first time, sitting in my office at home and just, you know, again, trying to put it out of my mind, but all just the flood of emotions went from my head straight into my heart. And I remember just beginning to just weep, like uncontrollably, like on my own in my office. And in that moment, my heart was really pierced with this issue of human trafficking. And the thing that I say is that is a wound that I pray I never recover from, because I think to live with a sense of compassion is to be alive. It's, you know, to live an empathetic life is the highest way to be in the world. Yeah. And so as painful as that reality is, I have given myself permission to live with a tender heart and an empathetic heart related to the injustice of human trafficking. And then from the aspect of, you know, that being like overwhelming, there's probably a lot more for us to unpack there, but I'll just give this one thought, as we kind of like get into this conversation, is I remember watching this movie, Schindler's List. Very big
I've
movie.
Heard of that before.
Yeah, you may have heard of it. Small filmmaker, Steven, what's his name? Spielberg?
Yeah. How do you pronounce that? Yeah. Silent G.
So there's a line in that film, and it's this line about the Jewish Talmud says that to save one life is to save the world entire. And so it's this idea that there's that every human life has so much indescribable intrinsic value. Yeah. And so that it's the idea that if I can make a difference in the life of one person, that is infinitely meaningful and valuable. And so that was something that I would say at the outset really helped to ground me in facing such a big, overwhelming, daunting issue.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, even like one of the reasons why this name of this podcast is called Imperfect is because, well, there's a lot of layers, but just like, even in this fight, like feeling like you have to have everything perfect and be equipped and the most knowledgeable and the most money and the most talent to do anything to help. And I think like for so long, because I am a perfectionist, like I was like, well, I'm not, who am I to? And I think there is some sensitivity towards like, these aren't necessarily our stories. And I think that like having that sensitivity for being survivor led is really important. But I think that's where leading with compassion and empathy, there's no room for that like savior mentality to come in, you know? But I think like when I scaled back, because I'm a perfectionist and I'm like, okay, like 40.3 million and only one, like the numbers I think get really daunting. And I think it is you can become very desensitized to the trauma of it. And so I had to like stop looking at this pragmatically. Even if you impact one person that is even inspired to do something about it, like that starts a whole trickle effect. And that's kind of what we were talking about before this is how I even came to meet you was through the work of amazing people like Kim that was forging the path forward, and she completely changed my life. And it's a really long-winded way of saying that when you look at the Holocaust, for example, I had a writing teacher that was talking about this. Like when you look at the Holocaust and you hear the staggering number of people that were killed, right? That's like so much that our human brains can't even comprehend that kind of pain and trauma. So you almost kind of like shut off just to protect yourself. Yeah. But we can connect with one person and one person's story, which is why Anne Frank's story is so powerful, because we can't fathom all those other people, but you can fathom that one human being, which we were born for that connection and that empathy to empathize with that one girl. So that's why I get really inspired by the filmmaking process and the ability to tell those stories in a way that is digestible and a way that can inspire hope as well. I want to also like bring that up too, just like as we do dive into this deeper part of what we're about to get into, is like holding fast to that hope, and then also like continuing to use like the creativity that you do is like so inspiring. So I'd love if you could talk a little more about your filmmaking too, and how your journey came to like merging those two.
Yeah, absolutely. I resonate with what you shared about being a perfectionist and wanting to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row, you know. And I think sometimes as perfectionists, or, you know, in a positive sense, those striving for excellence, we can put these barriers in our way to actually just doing the thing that we need to do, which is just to put one foot in front of the other one.
Yeah.
And my story is really one of, you know, I mean, I'm a person of faith. I look back on my story and I just see in my own weakness and my brokenness, my weak, simple yes, and just the determination to put one foot in front of the other has led to some really extraordinary impact. And I just look at that as an act of the providence of God that takes our weakness, you know, our 5 loaves and 3 fish, you know, and multiplies them into something so much bigger. So I go back to that phrase from that spoken word, is we have to resist the voice inside of us telling it's okay to do nothing. And so what is that thing, you know, that we can do? What is that next step? And so with regards to, just to answer your question directly, I think that that telling these stories is really valuable for people to understand what's going on in the world in a very real way. I don't think that statistics communicate as powerfully as, you know, a person's real lived story. So there was a film that really marked me in the early days of learning about human trafficking. That film was called Lilia Forever. And it's a film made by a Swedish filmmaker named Lucas Moodysson. And it's the real life story of this girl who was trafficked from Eastern Europe to Sweden. And this movie was very impactful in Sweden in activating the enforcement of key groundbreaking legislation that they had passed to fight trafficking. So I not only was so gripped by the story itself, but was able to see how it mobilized an entire nation to take action.
Wow.
And so that was one of the things that for me was very impactful in cultivating and developing a value for film as a means to have an impact in this space.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, even just, that's a great example. I love that movie. I was thinking about recently the show Dope Sick on Hulu. Like, they did such a great job of taking this really overwhelmingly dark issue of opioids and addiction. And it's like not something that you necessarily want to like on a Friday night, just like watch an episode of, but they use the power of narrative storytelling to draw the audience in and to make you care about these characters in the first episode, because like that is what it's about, is that empathy, you know, and you connect, and you don't even necessarily know where it's going besides like the marketing of the show, but then you're already locked in and you're invested. And that's like the power of storytelling and what we try to do, whether it's human trafficking stories or not. And I think I can geek out forever about like just that natural power that narrative and documentary storytelling has to draw people in to something that's really hard. Like, we're not asking for like a light thing here for people to lean into this, but it's important. And like you said, like we have to, what was the spoken word? Like we have to constantly
resist the voice inside of us telling us it's okay to do nothing about sex trafficking.
Yes. Yeah. And so when you look at the US specifically, And I'm glad that you mentioned how in Sweden they all mobilized around that. When you look at the US and, you know, your most recent docuseries highlights a lot of the legislative issues in the United States that lets specifically the porn industry continue with a lot of these really horrific things, but even human trafficking as well.
Okay, so Beyond Fantasy is a documentary miniseries that we produced, which is essentially an expose of the porn industry. And so we had, you know, gone into the porn industry to do this investigation, to understand kind of some of the dynamics of on the human rights side of the equation of pornography. So how was this being created? What was the impact on performers? What was the perspective of the people producing it? And so the series drills down into 3 primary areas, and those are embodied in each of the episodes. One is on this barely legal genre of pornography, and which is a genre that is predominantly uses teen girls, 18, 19 years old, you know, barely legal, but then dresses them up to look like they're 10, 11 years old. And so it's promoting the fantasy, you know, criminal fantasy of sex with children, essentially. The second episode is, which we're about to release, and that one is called Beyond Fantasy Hardcore, and that is on this more violent genre of pornography. And then the third one is called Unsafe Sex, and that one is on the epidemic of STIs and STDs in the porn industry and how that's handled. So Beyond Fantasy is a series that's an expose of the porn industry. So I think for a lot of people, you know, who maybe they think that there's nothing wrong with porn, or maybe somebody out there who is struggling in a cycle of pornography consumption and just hasn't been able to free themselves from that. I think this series will be really powerful to help create a more accurate understanding of and picture of what it is that they're actually consuming. And again, it draws attention to what we discovered is a human rights crisis that's occurring in this massive multi-billion-dollar unregulated industry.
Wow. Yeah, and there's a lot of layers to it of where we can go with this. And I think prior to watching that series, I was unaware of all of these facets and even the barely legal part of it, which we'll get into. But my kind of frame of reference was how it impacted human trafficking, not only in perpetuating the demand for it, but then also a lot of survivors and victims of trafficking have been forced to, participate in pornography. And then, so can you speak a little bit to that correlation as well of like, to your point, when people are not aware what they're consuming, how it's actually perpetuating the demand?
Yeah, stepping back from this film for a second, I think it's important to contextualize and frame kind of what's happening in our world just across the board in this generation. So we live in this really unique time that I've heard one sociologist describe as a grand social experiment that none of us signed up for. So we've been born into this unique period of time in which we live in a media-saturated world. And so there are unique challenges that go along with that. Historically, stories were developed and passed on through leaders in the community with a vested interest in protecting the community. So the idea of community, the idea of society is that we're better off doing it together than we are alone. And in that, there's certain values and principles and things that we understand are important to the protection of a society, of a community. And so those values were embedded into stories that were passed down through oral tradition or through writing and over literally centuries. And so we're a part of a generation where the primary role of storyteller has been usurped by these massive corporate entities, the music industry, the film industry, the television industry, the porn industry. And these entities do not have an inherent interest in protecting the values and flourishing and connectivity and nourishment and health of society. It's predominantly driven by profit motive, which ultimately is the science of exploitation. And so we live in this unique time where we're in a media saturated world, and the stories that we grow up with are often of a malevolent nature or of a devious nature or of, some other form. And so when you think about us as individuals and you think about us as social beings, socialization is just the process by which we internalize the stories that we grow up with in our world in the construction of our identity, our values, our worldview, all of that. So we are a part of this grand social experiment where we're growing up in this media saturated age. Add on top of that the dynamic of globalization and travel. We live in an interconnected planet now as well. So it's hard to separate out just what's happening here in the US from what's happening in other parts of the world. And I'll just give a couple seconds on that just to kind of give more of a global picture. So we live in this now interconnected planet, and a big part of what drove us to want to investigate the porn industry was based on things that we were discovering going on in other parts of the world. And so as I was making my first documentary, Nefarious Merchant of Souls, well, side plug there, we were investigating sex trafficking in countries all over the world and began to see these 5 specific ways that pornography was overlapping with sex trafficking. Wow. And so it was in the process of creating that film that then drove us to want to go investigate the porn industry. But I'll give just one example that you cited, which is this idea that pornography plays a role in cultivating and fueling the appetite for illicit sex. And so what we found is that, we would go to a place like Cambodia and be in an out of the way indigenous village where children were for sale. And then it was guys flying from America to go buy those children. So there was, so we started to do the math that, okay, this guy did not get up one day and decide to go fly halfway across the world to go buy a child for sex. Something happened in that person's life that brought them to that moment. So as we started to interview the Johns, the sex buyers, we discovered this common thread among all of them, which was that all of them had a history of prior pornography consumption from childhood. So that's not to say that every person who consumes pornography is going to end up a pedophile buying children in Cambodia, but it was enough of consistency to spark our interest in saying, what's going on here. And so I think that when we talk about the subject of pornography, we have to talk about it within the landscape of the larger context of growing up this media saturated age in a globalized planet, and see it as a part of this, world that we're living in that creates some very unique challenges for us to navigate as social beings.
Yeah, it's so important to have that context, and it's also terrifying because you don't realize, like, when you've grown up with that, really kind of what social experiment we're in, and how something that might be, seemingly unharmful to you, like watching something, could actually impact, not only that appetite for going and flying to Cambodia. I loved the story you told. It was like, I think it was that story when you guys were in Cambodia, and you told this at the event that we had of you guys were filming and you started chasing this guy and but having, again, what really I took away from your telling of that story was it brought you to a place of empathy for that human being, of like, this is a pathetic human being that wasn't always this way.
Yeah.
How did he get there, you know? And
Yeah.
so I think that's really important, to look at the whole of it and to look at all sides and to look at the psychology behind how does this even exist, you know?
Yeah.
Like, people didn't just wake up one day and decide, like, I'm going to go exploit this person.
Yeah.
And I think, like, there's been studies too, you would know way more about this than me, but just how consuming pornography even rewires your brain. And just like, there's so many statistics I can rattle off about how that has a detrimental impact on people. But getting back to kind of the commercialization of it, and even to your point about, we now live in a time where storytellers are these entities that don't have our best interests necessarily in mind, and they have a bottom line and a profit in mind. And there was actually a performer in your Beyond Fantasy expose. You asked her a question, and she goes, it might not be the fantasy we want to be selling, but clearly someone is buying it. So again, if someone is going to buy it, someone's going to make it. This is a completely capitalistic commercial enterprise. There are so many quotes like that throughout the series where I'm like, these are the people making it, and they're blatantly admitting that this is wrong and people are being exploited.
Yeah.
And I think I really quickly like wrote that down as she was saying this. I was like, I feel like I was in school taking notes, because I'm like, that is it. Like that summarizes what we're saying here, you know?
Yeah. What we discovered is, so we, as we began to investigate the porn industry, we discovered that there were a number of really alarming ethical concerns. I mean, maybe that's obvious. You know, maybe you don't even need to investigate the porn industry fully to come to that conclusion. But there were a number of ethical issues. And so our objective was to really let the porn industry speak for themselves. We didn't want to just bring in outsiders to give, you know, their commentary or sermonize about, you know, what was right or wrong in the porn industry. We really wanted to let the porn industry speak for themselves. So it was important for me, as a documentarian, to give the opportunity for them to answer for themselves when it came to really serious issues like promoting the fantasy of sex with a child or promoting the fantasy of raping a woman. In the real world, those are criminal acts. And so what was, I think, if there was anything that, you know, I would describe as like shocking in our investigation, was the blatancy with which they not only understood what they were doing, but were perfectly okay with it. So at the end of the day, we brought these questions for them to answer for themselves, and they had no answer. And so what we have is a small group of pornographers in the San Fernando Valley who are creating content that is setting the sexual template for a generation. It is colonizing the sexuality of a generation. These are people whose own conscience has been completely seared and who are creating content to continually push the boundaries of novelty in order to get more views and to sell more videos. So they have an inherent interest in preying on people's sexuality for the creation of profit, as she indicates. And so I think that for us who are living in this pornographic age, those are important things for us to consider and to think about what's going on. And so, yeah, part of the purpose with Beyond Fantasy has been to draw attention to those ethical issues, to really shine a light on them, and to help people see that pornography is not just this harmless, innocuous thing, that it's actually very malevolent and deviant, and is preying on people's sexuality and harvesting and shaping and colonizing people's sexuality into very deviant sexual appetites.
Yeah. And I mentioned this before about how like the Supreme Court made it legal to create porn in which adult performers are made to look like children in 2002. Like, I don't know enough backstory. I don't know enough backstory about that, but like, why do you think this is like we're allowing this to happen?
Yeah, I think that, just pulling way back, I view our world through this lens that there are malevolent and benevolent forces that are organizing in our world and influencing people's behavior and the stories that we tell and all of this. And right now, I think that like never before, we live in a generation where the protections for children are just being removed left and right, and where children are under assault. And so this, to me, is one emblematic evidence of that, where now we are, through legislation, legalizing the selling of the fantasy of sex with a child. And I just think that that's so harmful. And again, as a society, that's an important question that we have to ask ourselves is, what value do we hold for the protection of children?
Yeah.
And if we become a society that does not protect the children, I think that it's a very dark path that we are headed for. I think that is a symbol of the downfall of a society that abandons the protection of children. So the work that we are doing is really to help rebuild a conscience in a society that's lost its conscience, to help rebuild a value for the protection of children. And so that's why we have launched this End Teen Porn campaign, to raise the age of consent to enter porn from 18 to 21 years old, and to eradicate entirely the genre of teen pornography where they're made to look like prepubescent children. Everything that we are doing is in consideration of the next generation.
Yeah.
And unless we adopt that generational thinking, again, we're headed down an ominous path. I think that for us, our conviction, my conviction, what kind of drives us at Exodus Cry is this idea that every decision that we make is voting for the kind of world that we want to leave for our children. And so when it comes to something as serious as child sexual abuse, it's unthinkable that we would begin to pull back the layers of protection for children. And I think that's, it's a major heart check for us as a generation, and one of the key issues that we have to face.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, like, again, I always want to counter these like really hard questions, and like it can feel hopeless like talking about this, but there's a positive action we can take. And so I'm so inspired, and I'll link everything in here of how people can get to sign that petition, but it's just endteenporn.com. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's amazing. And also, like, what other, I don't want to go too deep down a rabbit hole, but I get really fascinated by, like, kind of in line with what your guys' mission is at Exodus Cry, is like looking at the systemic structures in place and in our society that allows this to flourish, whether it be pornography or sex trafficking. So was there anything throughout your investigation, either in this expose that you guys just produced or in Nefarious, that really shocked you legislatively and societally that allows this to happen?
Yeah, I think, thinking just specifically of the issue of pornography, there's another campaign in particular that is aimed at the lack of protections for children online. So the internet is still relatively new, and the internet came about around the mid 90s. So we're 25, 30 years into this experiment of the planet being hardwired with the internet. And I think that at this moment, it's important to take an inventory for, okay, where have we come with the internet and where do we need to go? Currently, the internet is a city without walls, and there are no protections for children in place online. And so, so if you think about, a child just looking for their favorite, cartoon character, Pokemon, could end up on a hardcore pornographic website. And pornographers are very intentional about using those children's characters as trap doors to pull kids in to becoming exposed to this content. And so we started another campaign called Protect Children, Not Porn, that would require big tech and big porn to put age verification walls in place for the hosting and distributing of all pornographic content. Wow. And essentially what that would do is it would require anyone who wanted to access pornography, it would force them to do it through providing a government-issued ID.
Oh, wow.
So that right there would be a significant statement of our value for protecting children. But the fact that we don't have that currently, and the way that this content can be accessed so inadvertently and easily just by surfing Google or whatever and hitting the wrong button, or, is such a reckless criminal disregard for protecting the innocence, the well-being, the health of children. And so I think that is one really important piece of legislation that that we need, which is the legislation of age verification.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily like this term because I think it's legitimizing of pornography in a way that's not helpful. But the porn industry refers to themselves as the adult entertainment industry. So even within that one term, though, they're conveying the knowledge that this is for adults.
Yeah.
Right? So, so even the porn industry understands that at some level, this is for adults, and yet no protections are provided to keep children from it.
Yeah.
And I'll give just one last example on this is a platform called Twitter. We're obviously all aware of Twitter. And they welcome 13-year-olds to create Twitter accounts while at the same time welcoming the most graphic, hardcore pornography onto their platform. So they're knowingly mixing these two worlds of quote unquote adult content with children. Wow. And if you're again on Twitter and you end up on the wrong page, you could, I don't even want to tell you, I won't even repeat things that I've seen on Twitter. It's so stomach turning. And yet that is how they have built their platform. And so the question that I have is, where is our conscience as a society? Yeah. And so we feel that part of our role at Exodus Cry is to raise awareness about these things, to provoke the conscience of people who may not even have considered this. Yeah. The lie that we've been sold in our generation is that this life is all about us. Yeah. So we live in this vain, nihilistic, self-indulgent, narcissistic culture that is selling us a lie that our fulfillment as human beings comes from some form of self-promotion and popularity. And the truth is, the deeper truth is that is an empty path. Yeah. True fulfillment comes by being in the world in a way that is loving and empathetic. And so finding our core identity in empathizing with people around us and relating to them through at the highest ethic of love. Mm-hmm. And so we're just pulling back the layers here, but I am very concerned about the lack of conscience in our generation and in our society, and think that we are at a very critical moment of deciding what kind of society do we want to be, and what kind of world are we going to pass on to our children.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just like, there's so much there that I'm like, one thing that really struck me in like my research and even my experience with like, I've tutored a lot of kids in the past, and just like seeing what they have access to and seeing like, how are we protecting them? And there was a few statistics, like even just highlighting how the internet has like perpetuated this and like exposing and exploiting children. One of them was with NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The amount of child sexual abuse material online has exploded in the past 2 decades. In 1998, there were 3,000 reports of sexual abuse material, child porn. By 2014, that number was 1 million. And then in 2021 alone, that number was 29.3 million. You look at the exponential impact of that, and that's what you just said, of like, we're at a very pivotal moment here. It's getting back to what we said in the beginning, like what impact can I have? Like we all have to make, because otherwise that number is only going to keep growing, and we're going to be in a place where there is no accountability. And so I think like that, when I heard those numbers, I was like, I wanted to throw up. Like it's so enraging, and I think it's important to like mention the scope of this, because otherwise it's like, oh yeah, this is a really bad issue, like, and then you go back to your day, but it's like, no, this is like, this number is growing. That was 2014 to 2021, 7 years, it grew 28 million. Like that's crazy. And so I don't really know what I'm going with this, other than just like ranting about like how crazy this is.
Well, I think just sounding the alarm that this is such a big issue. And again, you know, the passion that I hear you conveying is the wrestle of, man, like there's so many of us that either don't understand really what's going on, we're just not aware, or maybe we are aware, but we haven't done anything about it. And so, you know, in my getting to know you, I can tell that this is a very serious issue to you, and you want other people to feel that and to embrace that same level of seriousness when it comes to this issue. So we're sounding the alarm on there's 20 million, you know, and like, don't you care? And I feel that. And I think that's the work that we have in front of us, right? The work that we have in front of us is to try to wake people up. Because we've been sold a lie, and to some extent we've all bought into it. You know, we think that we see ourselves in these small little bubbles that we've created, these small little silos, and we care more about getting likes on Instagram than we do, you know, ending the sexual exploitation of children that is rampant in our world. And so something's not connecting there. And so I think it's important having conversations like this to begin to unpack this and go, guys, like, what is the lie that we've bought into that causes us to value getting likes on social media more than we do giving ourselves for the protection of children?
And to that point, I feel like just being like very honest and vulnerable here, like for a while, like when I first started to get passionate about this, and obviously it's like, I don't want to be the bummer. Like, I don't want to, like I make the joke that like, you can't take me anywhere. Like I'll start talking about human trafficking at weddings, and I'm like, I hate being that person, you know, but like once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And I think specifically though, with the porn element of it, it's like, can be uncomfortable to talk about, you know? And there's also an element of like, and anyone listening, I want to like reiterate this, like there's grace on all sides, you know, and this isn't sitting here pointing fingers at people and saying you're a terrible person if you watch porn. We just want to raise awareness of like what it actually is that you're consuming, and how this not only fuels the demand for an entire industry, but then fuels the demand for sex trafficking, and then also has a detrimental impact on your own personal relationships and your relationship with how you view sex. And so for me, a big stepping stone was having to let go of the fear of man, and having to let go, saying man, like sounds like a very biblical thing, but like fear of other people and other people's judgments of you. And that really plays in with the social media thing too. And like, I had to look at myself in the mirror and say like, am I going to hold back on what I'm sharing about this that I see is like true evil that's happening at the expense of like having other people like me, and like, you know, because I know that these conversations will ruffle feathers and people might not want to engage, but I think that I just wanted to address that too, that like I realized anyone listening to this, like we're not asking you to get involved in something that's super easy to talk about, but I think the more that we can all be willing to have those conversations and have it with grace and not in a place of judgment is really, really important.
Yeah. Well, you're carrying something that's very authentic. You're carrying an authentic connection to the plight of those that are suffering this. And then so from there, it does become a bit of a wrestle to know, like, how do I carry this? Because I know that, like, for myself, once I learned what was going on, it was really difficult for a season for me to be at a wedding and just make small talk. Like, my heart is burning for something that is so intense. And so it's taken me a long time to find some balance where I can still be true to that authentic part of myself that's carrying this very real burden, while also being able to put that aside for moments to do self-care or just to engage people in lighter conversation. So it's a process, you know, but I hear a lot of grace in your tone, thinking about people who, you know, maybe are consumers of pornography. I struggled myself for a long time with people who were consuming porn because I could see the connection to sex trafficking and all these things. So I had a real angry chip on my shoulder. And I remember this one day in particular that I was in prayer, and I was praying this real precatory prayer of, you know, basically like a prayer of condemnation over people who look at porn and and just kind of letting my heart out, you know. And I remember that as I was praying this, I had this picture in my mind's eye of this person who was a middle-aged person, and as the porn consumer, and I'm angry, and the person's face changes from this middle-aged person to like a 10, 11-year-old boy. And I remember in that moment, my heart just breaking.
Wow.
And being filled with the compassion of realizing how many men's lives and women have been hijacked by pornography from a young age.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people today are really in the battle of shame and behavior, this ping pong relationship between the behavior, consuming porn, triggering the shame, and then the shame triggering the behavior, and can't break themselves free from it.
Yeah.
So a lot of people that are in that place started when they were innocent children.
Wow.
And I don't know that a lot of those people have even considered that themselves.
Right.
So there's a lot of value in finding self-compassion and going back to that child and talking to that child and apologizing that no adult was there to protect them from those things that they were being exposed to at that moment.
Yeah.
So I think recovering a value for self, recovering a sense of compassion for oneself, at the same time as seeing the reality that this fantasy world that has been promoted to us is a lie.
Yeah.
So pornography oftentimes is not so much a moral and a spiritual struggle as much as it is as a neurological struggle and a fantasy addiction.
Yeah.
It's something that started as childhood, began to shape the brain into this compulsive behavior, and then the fantasy part of this, the way of dealing with life's challenges by escaping into this fantasy world where I'm okay, I'm desired, I'm seen, there's gratification. So if somebody is triggered by rejection, anxiety, boredom, a difficult day, a stressful day at work, whatever it is that's driving them into that fantasy world, part of the way to deal with that is to disrupt the fantasy with truth. Yeah. So this thing that I talk about and that we talk about at Exodus Cry is this idea of disrupting the fantasy and redirecting the behavior into something else that's positive to retrain the brain. So when we talk about the heaviness of trafficking, we're not trying to beat people over the head and shame people into, don't watch porn because, that's just part of it. Mm-hmm. Is the idea of being aware isn't meant to beat people. It's meant to show how our behavior is connected to something that is resulting in the destruction of human life.
Yeah.
So I'll just give one kind of example on this that to kind of clarify this point. I was sitting down with a pornography performer who had been in the industry for 6 months. She was 18 years old. And she was so she had gone into it because she saw Jenna Jameson talk about how great pornography was when on E! Entertainment when she was around 13. And she thought, oh, that's what I need to do to be glamorous and rich and famous and all these things. So she joins the porn industry, and it's one horror story after the next. At some point in the interview, I couldn't believe that she was still continuing to pursue a life in porn. And I asked her, I was like, the question just came out of me because it just felt like the next thing to ask. I was like, what do you even want in life?
Wow.
And it was the first time in the interview where she just stopped, and you could see in her eyes that she was crossing this personal threshold of entering back into her own humanity. Wow. And escaping out of this shell of the pornified, character that she was playing. And she said, with tears streaming down her face, she said, I just want to be loved.
Oh my gosh.
And it just took my breath away, because I thought, wow, if you just look at her Twitter page, you would think this is somebody who likes this, is making money off of this, deserves this. But that's a very two-dimensional picture of who these people really are. Getting to know the real person, I was able to see a whole three-dimensional human who had history, experiences, desires, dreams, and was sold a lie. And so she said, I said, what would that look like? And she said, just somebody bringing me flowers. She said, nobody's ever even brought me flowers. So, just something so simple like that, that we take for granted, is driving somebody to live out this existence where they're being completely taken advantage of and exploited. Wow. And 2 days later, she called us from the hospital, and she had been rushed to the hospital early in the morning after being up all night because of some medical complications to all the pornography that she was performing in. And we had just met her 2 days before, and we were the only safe people. After 6 months in the porn industry, we were the only safe people that she felt like she could call to come help her.
Wow.
That's
amazing.
So we were the first people to bring her flowers, this girl that we had just met 2 days before. And it just makes you think about the fragility of life and what we really need. And so for anyone who's sitting down at a computer at their device and thinking, they're going to go have a good time and gratify themselves on porn, you just don't know who's on the other side of that screen. Yeah. And why gamble with somebody else's personal well-being to satisfy yourself sexually?
Wow.
Like,
That's
so, yeah, so I think that's really what I hear us both advocating for in this conversation, is a way of being in the world that is empathetic and loving and considerate of others and considerate of children and ultimately considerate of ourselves.
yeah.
Like, this isn't helping us.
Yeah.
Pornography is not helping us.
Yeah. Well, I have two things I want to say. First of all, thank you for sharing that. That's such as heartbreaking as that is, it's such a beautiful story of redemption as well, and that there is hope, and I think with what we were saying of like making that choice to engage and making that choice, and yeah, it's going to come at a cost of having to weigh this and whatever, but one of the things, this has changed my life getting involved in this work, and like, yeah, there's that heaviness, but the amount of fulfillment I feel through having experiences with people like that, and like seeing just like little glimpses of hope and redemption, it is so much more than, not doing this. I can't imagine being fulfilled in any other way. So like, this isn't all just like a bummer. Like, it's such a beautiful experience of being human and getting to, step into those places and have those conversations. And the second thing I'll say, just a little darker there, is I want to highlight what you said of like, from the outside on her Twitter, it looks like she's just, like successful and however making a lot of money, and she enjoys this and she wants to be there. That is the same story that I hear time and time again of trafficking victims and survivors. And this is a whole other podcast topic, but the prostitution industry, but there's such a crossover between the two, and people a lot of times will assume that a prostitute, quote unquote, is choosing to be there, but a lot of times is a survivor of trafficking, or a victim of trafficking if they're still in it. And a lot of the tactics that traffickers use, the pornography industry is also using to recruit performers, and then also using those same tactics to draw people in to watch it, of like, you need this or whatever I don't want to be too vague, but I also don't want to go too niche into that. But I really just want to highlight to everyone, because it's such all of these people, whether it be traffickers or pornographers or these industries at large, have a vested interest in having you be deceived to see what it really is. And so and to use your language, like peeling back the onions of like, okay, that girl that you see on the street that you assume is a prostitute and wants to be there, most likely is a victim of trafficking. This girl that might seem like she's like loving being in the porn industry, either A, may have been trafficked to be there, or B, is really just crying out for love and attention.
Yeah. Well, so once again, I think that it's important to provide a little bit of framing for discussing the larger issue of the commercial sex industry and how pornography and prostitution intersect and overlap. Just some scaffolding to that, I think, will be helpful. First of all, there's been a real, what's the right word? There's been a real, I don't want to say evolution of sexuality, because that would imply something positive is happening. There's just been a real transforming of the way that we understand our sexuality since around the 1950s, the late 1940s. So there was a book called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male that came out, which was by Alfred Kinsey, and really was a linchpin for changing people's perceptions of sexuality. Hugh Hefner then launched Playboy magazine in 1952, 53, as kind of extension of that book. So he said, if Kinsey was the researcher, I am his pamphleteer. And the impact that that Playboy had on our sexuality was one, taking pornography from the back street to the main street. It was really mainstreaming the idea of pornography. But then the impact was a catalyst for moving our sexuality from something that was more protected into something that was more objectified. And so there was a real devaluing and desacralization of our sexuality that ultimately found expression through the sexual revolution of the 1960s. So there was somebody named Giacomo who said, we say that, the sexual revolution has, created this, I forget the exact quote, but it's this idea that it's had this positive impact, but the reality is that it's just made sex less meaningful. And so we saw this evolution. And then when the internet came out, we saw the second major evolution of human sexuality so what I would say, we went with Playboy from a relational sexuality to an object sexuality. And when the internet came out, we went from an object sexuality to a malevolent sexuality. What I mean by that is a corporate adopting of a sexuality that finds pleasure in the pain and destruction and robbing of innocence of others. And that is really what we see embodied in the mainstream porn industry today. So I'm saying all that to say, to come back to this point that I believe that our sexuality has been very misrepresented and mishandled over the course of the past 70 years. And so I think that we as a people and as a generation struggle with our sexuality like never before. To truly understand the sexual spirit is to understand the fragility of our sexual serenity. So that can be disrupted by something as simple as an urge that is subconsciously conveyed to somebody, or a word that is spoken. The idea of catcalling can be very disruptive to somebody's sexual serenity. And so now take that human being, right? There's no subclass of human beings that were born into this planet for the sole purpose of becoming a sex object for other people to take advantage of. That version of a human being does not exist. Yeah. And so take that idea of our sexual fragility and serenity and now place that person in the context of an industry that depends on their being penetrated by multiple strange men with deviant fantasies all day, every day. Like, what is the outworking of that over time? And so at Exodus Cry, there came a point when we stopped trying to define in and out who is a worthy versus an unworthy victim, who had chosen this versus not chosen this, because what we had seen is that regardless of how somebody ended up in the commercial sex industry, all of them were being exploited. So chose this, not chose this, we don't even try to answer that. We're just looking at the dynamic of how someone will experience the sex industry when they're in it. The first and most important thing to say is that the basis of all prostitution is on the basis of an inequality of desire. You have somebody there who wants to have the sex, and you have somebody there who doesn't want to have the sex. Therefore, payment takes place. So the problem with that is that sex and desire are inextricably linked. And to have sex without desire is to experience it as a form of violation, regardless if somebody's getting paid for it. So just to put this into perspective, two people sit down at the table, but the sex buyer, he puts the money on the table. Mm-hmm. And at the other side of the table is the person who's there being sold for sex. He says, you can take the money and leave, or you can stay for the sex. What is that person going to do? 10 times out of 10, she's going to take the money and leave. Why? Mm-hmm. She doesn't want the sex. Mm-hmm. So inherently, there is this inequality of desire built into the arrangement that is happening in prostitution. The way that people then experience that over time is through dissociation in order to survive the experience. So what that person has to do is compartmentalize their body in such a way that allows them to survive the experience of prostitution. Again, to survive the experience of having strange men use their body for their own desires and interests with no consideration of themselves. One after the next, after the next, after the next, after the next, day after day after day after day. So what people and survivors of prostitution have told us is that they will protect certain parts of themselves. Like, you can't kiss me, or you can't caress my left arm. It's a way of channeling their humanity into a part of their body, and in this way of dissociating from the experience in order to survive it. So over time, one literally has to fracture their own humanity to survive the experience of prostitution again, that they experience as violating because they don't desire that man, his fantasy, et cetera, wow. One after the next. So the outworking of that over time is all kinds of mental health issues. PTSD is universal in prostitution among everybody who experiences it. So I think that when it comes to the larger global commercial sex industry, we're asking the wrong questions. The question that I hear asked all the time is, well, did she choose it? That's not the right question to be asking. The right question to be asking is, why is she there in the first place? And what does she have to do to survive that? So prostitution is about the exploitation of vulnerability. It preys upon vulnerable demographics of people who are marginalized in society for any number of reasons and find themselves in the situation where they're now having to sell their body in order to get through life. And then the experience of that is deeply destructive to their humanity. Again, going back to what I said at the beginning, if we understand the fragility of our sexuality and the serenity of the sensitivity of our sexual spirit is the only way that we can understand the tsunami that is invoked on one's sexuality in the sex industry. Yeah. So the idea that I'm going to be, guy number, like, one survivor of prostitution told me that she had been with more than 10,000 men, so the idea that I'm going to be 7,482 and it's somehow going to enhance my humanity and it's all okay because she chose this. It's a perspective that is deeply out of touch with the reality of who we are as humans, how our sexuality is a part of our being, and what brought us to this moment through the inception of the normalization and widespread proliferation of pornography.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for providing that scaffolding, because I didn't even know, I didn't even have some of that perspective, and even the way that you laid out of what were the 3 words? It was like,
a relational sexuality? Object sexuality and malevolent sexuality.
Yeah. So relational, object, and malevolent. That is so helpful, I think, too, for conceptualizing how this has evolved or devolved, I guess you can say. And also the fact that what socially and culturally, what was culturally happening at those times to make those changes, and technologically happening, and then also where does legislation fall into all of this and allowing these things. And so I think I always geek out over those big picture scaffoldings, because anyone listening is going to have a different area of expertise. So you and I happen to be really passionate about filmmaking and see the avenue there and making an impact, but then there might be lawyers or people involved in politics listening to this and having that conceptualization, and even people listening in the tech world. I think it's just so important to see all these big factors and how they all link together, because there is no way that one or even a group of us is going to tackle all of these things. But I think understanding what all the factors are that are working together to push this forward, and even understanding, I just had this thought when you were talking about the girl and how that fractured her, and but then also the man involved in the other side. And then also you step out, take a step back, and I've just heard oh, we're going to a bachelor party to Vegas, are there gonna be hookers there? And you hear this thing that it's stamp rite of passage, you're a man for doing this. Is our culture has allowed that to be a cool thing to buy sex, or And then thinking of like from a woman's standpoint of like, okay, like this is something that guys value, is like women being like so free in their sexuality. And then like, how does that impact, you know, even me growing up, like having that perception of like, and going off to school of like how I engage in the world. And so I think like we can go down like these really narrow pigeonholes of like how at the darkest and most extreme levels, this like poor girl that said she's been with 10,000 men, how that has impacted her personally, but then zooming out and seeing how the culture that we create around buying that sex impacts all of us in ways subliminally that we might not even realize. And another plug for your film Liberated, which is the film I saw that Kim was in, kind of touches on all of this of like how the culture of like hookup culture has perpetuated even that desire to go buy sex with people. And well, I'll let you speak really briefly to that Liberated and like kind of how that fits into this bigger discussion that we're having.
Yeah, Liberated is a documentary that explores the stories that we tell in culture about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and what it means to be a sexual being. And specifically, it shows how the intersection of those messages results in a culture of sexual violation. So in the 5 years of filming that we did at spring break, I didn't meet a single young woman who had not been sexually violated during her time at spring break.
Wow.
So I'll just say that again, because it's just 5 years filming at spring break. Did not meet one single young woman who had not been sexually violated during her time at spring break. So that is a culture of sexual violation. That's not a few bad apples. It's not a fringe reality. It is something happening in our culture. And what is happening is, and this is an important way, I think, for people to see the world, is that the world is not so much a battle of good versus evil as much as it is truth versus deception. And so I think that when we look out at the landscape of our culture, we have to ask the question, what is influencing me? What is influencing my values, my worldview, my identity? Am I under the influence of truth? Am I under the influence of deception? This form of critical thinking is so essential to me as a documentarian, because our entire focus as documentarians is to find the deeper truth, to help our audience descend below the surface level of consciousness where most people live their normal lives. And as part of that, to displace the cover narrative, like the surface of the glacier, so to speak, and to displace the cover narrative with the deeper truth. But I think that if people will just pause to ask themselves, what is influencing me? We can begin to discover, wow, like I'm under the influence of what I'm being told by these very polarized media outlets. I'm being influenced by the values I see being conveyed on social media. I'm under the influence of, an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. I'm under the influence of whatever those things are. But these influences are shaping our way of being in the world. And so with Liberated, it was really an exploration of what are those stories in culture that are shaping our conceptions of gender and sexuality? What are those stories in culture that are shaping my idea of what it means to be a man? So the key thread that emerged through the making of this documentary was this idea of men's entitlement to women's bodies. So what we found is that the primary message to women in our culture was about being hot, that your primary value comes from your sex appeal. So the message is be hot. And again, I could bear that out with endless examples. The message to men was consume. And so men finding their value from consuming lots of women and then scoring points among their male peers by the number of women that they consume as a sign of being, a bigger, better man, of being a baller, being a player. For example, Dan Bilzerian was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and Joe Rogan referred to him as the biggest baller on the planet. So his entire fame is built on surrounding himself with a harem of women who are nothing more than his ornamental sex trinkets to make him look powerful and awesome. And so there was this thing that emerged, which was men's entitlement to women's bodies. Now set them in an environment where they have access to women's bodies, throw a little bit of alcohol and music into the mix, take away accountability, and what you have is a situation where women were being gang raped on the beach, nobody doing anything about it. Dudes propping girls up on their shoulders and then ripping their tops and bottoms off, chanting, suck our dicks, show your tit. No accountability at all whatsoever. What you had was a mob ready to rape. That is the outworking of a pornographic culture that is being lied to about who they are, what their sexuality is for, all of these things. So the answer for us as especially storytellers is to tell the truth and to help reclaim an authentic way of being in the world. And I think that is, again, the highest way to be human and to be fully alive.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I remember, I watched that 2 years ago, but I still remember just my blood boiling. But I also, as shocking as it was, it made sense, because when you step back and you look at these cultural narratives, it's that makes sense. Why we ended up here. It's not right, obviously, but these stories and these narratives that get pushed on, and even getting back to the power of filmmaking, and we're talking about using it for good, but let's be real, of what's shown as norm in TV and movies has set this stage for growing up of oh, well, everyone does this. So I'm actually deviant if I don't, and kind of conditioning people to be in that mindset. And again, this isn't all media is bad, but just taking a step back, I love what you said of what's influencing me, and actually having that gut check of what have I accepted as truth that's maybe actually deception, and is detrimental not only to me but to other people when you look at it as a whole. And so that's what I love, is it's just how this is beautifully connected. What you did with Liberated is also connected to what we were just talking about in the beginning with your most recent docuseries, and all of these things connect, and that's not a coincidence. It's because the work that you're doing, as we stated at the beginning, and as Exodus Cry states on its website, is to really uncover these systemic issues. And naturally, when you're looking at the roots, there's going to be these things that pop up that actually all connect. And so I say that to kind of somewhat land the plane here. I made a joke earlier before we started recording this. I was going to like keep Ben here for 3 hours because we can talk about everything for so long. Yeah. But
so last thought as we kind of land this, first of all, just thanks again for, your having me on this podcast and just your own boldness in hosting conversations like this. I think that part of the struggle that we're facing right now, where I would like to see growth, is that for us who are filmmakers and storytellers and artists, it's very important that we are people who are nonconformists and critical thinkers. And it's very sad and tragic plight of our times that the arts has become in many ways a system of conformity, and to challenge the status quo, which I believe is our job as artists and filmmakers and storytellers, to challenge the status quo is to risk being canceled. So part of the challenge right now is the fear that people have of, I want to be seen and celebrated and connected and cherished and valued as a human being, and yet the way to achieve that is to conform to a system that is really unhealthy and needs to be challenged right now. So it's this moment where we need courage as storytellers and filmmakers and artists to navigate these times that we're living in and be willing to risk cancellation, to be willing to risk being stigmatized or whatever it is, to challenge the status quo of what's going on. And again, as a documentarian, I don't think that this genre will survive unless we actually are willing to do that. And so I'm just, very passionate on that side of things.
But well, thank you for sharing that, because I completely agree. And I think it's really important to not only hold ourselves accountable, but then, create a culture around that, like within our filmmaking community, within our creative community, within whatever community you're in. If you're listening to this, like, we all have so much more impact than we think. And you never know, like, what just one small step of boldness and courage and advocating for what's right can actually set in motion. And first of all, I also just wanted to open up if there was anything else that, like, we talked about today that we didn't encompass with kind of like the bigger picture of what you're doing at Exodus Cry and just like what you're passionate about sharing. Was there?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, I think we covered it. I think right now, just, as we're getting beyond fantasy, this series on the porn industry out, I would just encourage everyone to check that out. Yeah. Your listeners and viewers can follow us at Exodus Cry. Mm-hmm. We're continually putting out calls to action and highlighting, what films we're releasing, but that's a big focus for us right now. So yeah. And so that's what I was gonna also say. Like, I had so many quotes written down because I'm such a nerd and I'm like doing my homework and I'm like, this is so good, like from watching the film. But I just want to encourage people to watch it, because I could have sat here and give you like the highlight reel, but I think like what you accomplished was so powerful and so heart-wrenching, and it's worth every minute of watching. So if you go to endteenporn.com, there's also a tab on there that says about, I believe, or watch. endteenporn.com, beyondfantasy.com, exoduscry.com. Any of those people will be connected to the film. So,
Yeah. So everyone listening, please go watch that. And there's also the petition on there where you can sign. It takes literally 30 seconds, if that. And if you could leave people with like one last thing, like what would it be?
I think the thing that we started with, which is this idea of the one. Mother Teresa said, had I not picked up that one child in Calcutta, I never would have picked up the 40,000. Wow. So how can we be a more authentic version of ourselves as humans? It's taking an interest in the plight of one person and choosing to show that person love and compassion to help make a difference in the life of somebody who needs help. Mm. And so I think if we all do that, we're going to change the world and make it a safer place for children, a more empathetic world. And I have hope for us as humanity to that end. So that's, I think, what I would leave off with.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Benji, for being here today and just for all the work that you're doing. I am so inspired by you. And like I shared before, like even before I met you, like your work has inspired me as a filmmaker and someone that is in this, advocacy work. And so thank you. Thank you everyone for listening and leaning into this like not so light conversation. Please do check out endteenporn.com and Exodus Cry and just all the amazing things that they're doing. And we'll see you next week.